Okay, well, we shrunk a little from last week, but I know we have some people that are sick and other distractions probably tonight. But we usually start with any prayer requests that anybody might have. So anything on your mind you'd like us to pray for as we begin? Yes.
Let's be praying for Rhonda's mom. She could come home anytime from the, what do you call that, rehab, but it's gonna be a hard time being able to handle life with only one arm, and there's a lot of questions. Please pray, and also yourself.
Okay. Anything else? All right, Lord, we just are thankful for the blessings of this morning. And I pray that you will bless our time together tonight, that this can be helpful in understanding certain passages of the Bible that are somewhat foreign to us. We want to bring Marge Ramlow before you once again, and I know she'll be coming home soon from the rehab, and yet trying to do what needs to be done with one arm. I just pray that you would give wisdom in how to manage. And Lord, I pray you be with those that are sick. I know a number of people that were here last week are not able to be here because of that. So please bring healing. We pray in Jesus' name, amen. We are on page 11 in your books. When Dr. Hudson was still a member of our church, he did a series on slavery that was excellent. I don't know how many of you were there at that time and how much we remember of that, but slavery was very prominent throughout Bible times, and the Bible does talk about it a lot. We'll just give kind of a brief treatment of that tonight to begin with. So, middle of the page there, slavery, the practice of slavery. Slavery was an integral part of life for thousands of years. The economy of Israel, Greece, and Rome were dependent upon this cheap form of labor. It's important to understand ancient slavery because many of our biblical terms were adapted from that practice. When writers such as Paul and Peter sought to explain Christ's sacrifice for us, they resorted to the vivid imagery of slavery. While Jesus Christ could not always guarantee physical freedom, he provided the means for spiritual liberty both now and for eternity. Number 3, a Jew who found himself hopelessly in debt could choose slavery as an alternate to prison or other punishment. Now, one thing that we should point out is that slavery in Bible days is very much different from what slavery was in the past 100 years or so. Even in America, slaves were just property. They had absolutely no rights. Nothing that they could claim as theirs, and oftentimes were treated very harshly. And while it's true that there probably would have been some slave owners in Bible times that resorted to that kind of tactic, by and large, slaves were viewed more as a servant in the house rather than what we would think of as a slave. So under Jewish law, there were a couple of means of acquiring a slave, and one of those would have been selling one's self. We have an example of that in Leviticus chapter 25, verse 39, and if thy brother that dwelleth by thee be waxen poor, and be sold unto thee, thou shalt not compel him to serve as a bond servant. So a volunteer slave, they're underselling oneself. A volunteer slave was to be treated as a hired hand. There was a very different set of laws concerning a Jewish slave as in I can't think of the word I want to say, but it was different between a Jewish slave or someone who was from outside the Jewish nation. And so, somebody tell me what the year of Jubilee is. Does anybody know what the year of Jubilee is?
That's where people that sold land and things like that, I think it was like every 50 years, it went back to the original owners.
Okay, actually, every seventh year. Every seventh year was a year of Jubilee, and then you're right, Tom, on the 70th seven, it was 2 years in a row that they were to do no work. And so for that seventh year, no work was to be done, but God provided that there was sufficient crop the years before so that they wouldn't have to do that kind of hard labor. So if there's no hard labor, what are the slaves going to do? Well, the slaves were then to be released. So B, he was to be released at the year of Jubilee. And as Tom mentioned, land was to be restored to the former owner, and any financial retribution that was to be made, depending on how long the land was in his possession and so on. So, see, if he had gotten married during his servitude, he could become a bond slave for life. So here's the process. A man sells himself into slavery. And then in the interim, he gets married. Well, according to Jewish law, his wife belonged to the slave owner. And when his time was up, the year of Jubilee, he had a choice to make. If any children were born in the meantime, they belonged to the slave owner as well. And so very commonly what happened was an individual in that position would not want to leave his wife and his children, and so he would become what's called indentured servant or bond slave. And remember the process. He was to stand up next to a post, and with an awl they would pierce his earlobe and put in a gold ring, I think, if I remember right. And he then was that man's property for life, as well as the wife and children. So that's the bond slave for life. And then a second way of acquiring slaves was a victim of debt. Some people in this condition were forced into slavery, and we have several examples of that in the Bible, New and Old Testament. One example would be a thief who was unable to repay what he had stolen. And in Exodus chapter 22, it's talking about this particular procedure. And if it be stolen from him, he shall make restitution unto the owner thereof. Some actually sold their children into slavery because of poverty. Now, I have an example of that in Nehemiah chapter 5, but I'm not going to read those. You can look those up later if you want to. You see the reference there in Nehemiah 5, 1 through 5, but the one we'll consider tonight is 2 Kings 4, 1. Now there cried a certain woman of the wives of the sons of the prophets unto Elisha, saying, Thy servant, my husband, is dead, and thou knowest that thy servant did fear the Lord, and the creditor is come to take him unto him my two sons to be bondmen. So that was, again, a very common way that a person ended up being a slave. Now, slaves in Israel were treated very much different than slaves in Rome. Slave owners in Rome were typically very cruel, but not so much in the Jewish economy. They were more like household servants. A third way was to purchase foreigners. Jewish law forbade either selling or stealing a Jewish slave in Deuteronomy chapter 24. However, Jewish people often bought foreigners as slaves, and there was different rules. If you read through Exodus, Leviticus, you'll see a lot of that, Deuteronomy. Different protection, C is protection for Jewish slaves. And there are 10 different items that describe protection of Jewish slaves. And so I'm just going to read those. They're not in your notes anywhere. but I think this is very interesting. This is primarily out of Leviticus 25. First of all, I already mentioned he had to be freed after 6 years, or even if it was second, third year into Jubilee anyway, he had to be freed. Second, if he married while in slavery, he was free to stay forever with the master. Third, if he married a wife provided by the master and they had children, he could not take the wife and children with him when he left. 4, if a master accepted someone's daughter as a slave, he could not sell her to foreigners. 5, if she married the master's son, she became his daughter. 6, a slave wife who was deprived of food, clothing, and affection could go free. 7, the poor man who sold himself as a slave was to be treated as a hired servant and not as a slave. 8, the master could not treat a Jewish slave ruthlessly. 9, slaves could be redeemed by relatives. And 10, a freed slave was to be given supplies so he could renew his life. So most of what we know about treatment of slaves in the Old Testament we learned from the Bible itself. Otherwise, there's not much. Josephus didn't talk about it much. The Jewish historians didn't. Most everything we know came from the Bible itself. And I already mentioned D, marking a slave. Exodus 21:6, then his master shall bring him to the judges. He shall also bring him to the door or to the doorpost, and his master shall bore his ear through with an awl, and he shall serve him forever. Any comments, questions on slavery? Maybe some things you picked up along the way? Okay. Then the next item is agriculture. Do we have a, okay, that's a picture of a well. And when we were over in Israel, there were wells that looked a whole lot like that. So having water, having sufficient water, has always been a problem in Israel. And there's some reasons for that. Number 2, annual rainfall varies from nearly none at the Dead Sea area to about 40 inches in Upper Galilee. However, if you go to Jerusalem, you're going to see vegetation all over the place. It's green all over the place. How do they accomplish that? Irrigation, right? So there's a lot of irrigation that takes place from the Jordan River and other resources. When it does rain there, it often comes down in number 3 there, much of the rain comes in heavy downpours. And so huge cisterns were built to store rainwater. Be as stony fields in Matthew chapter 13, verse 5. Some fell upon stony places where they had not much earth, and forthwith they sprung up because they had no deepness of earth. In this story told by Jesus, the sower's seed landed on a rocky place, could not survive. Some soil covered the rock substratum, but not enough to hold water necessary to support the plant. So a plant would spring up quickly because of the warmth of the shallow soil, but it could not be sustained. So even in Bible days, way back in the Old Testament, they still had some pretty elaborate irrigation systems in order to be able to survive and grow their crops. Linda, I don't remember much about when we were there, about the different kinds of irrigation.
Yeah, that's actually becoming a problem today because they are using like the Jordan River for power and for irrigation so much. That's why the Dead Sea is starting to fade away into nothing. So yeah, but then also there was other things that they try to, but God has given them.
Actually, our guide worked in a banana plantation, and we're driving by and we see this huge, it's like huge canopy, and somebody asked, what in the world is that? Well, it's a banana plantation. So they've obviously, to survive, you had to work through this difficult situation. And so today, there are plentiful irrigation systems, and it's green everywhere you go. Not everywhere. There were some places where it was still very barren, but not in the place where people lived. Planting, the best method available was to harness 2 oxen to a plow. And then page 13, they were not supposed to use 2 different kinds of animals. Deuteronomy 22:10, thou shalt not plow an ox and an ass together. And then Paul made use of that illustration in 2 Corinthians 6:14. Be ye not unequally yoked together with unbelievers, for what fellowship hath righteousness with unrighteousness, and what communion hath light with darkness? So why do you suppose, basically there were 2 kinds of animals that were used for plowing. One would be an ox, the other would be a donkey or something like that. Any idea why the Bible would forbid using 2 different kinds? It had to be 2 oxen or two donkeys, 2 oxen.
The donkey's pretty stubborn. They don't work together.
Okay, that's a very good answer. They don't work together well. What do we know? Yes. Yes. Yes, a donkey is a very strong animal, but the oxen is much stronger. And so it was considered to be an unequal yoke. And so that's a really a vivid illustration of what Paul is talking about here in 2 Corinthians, an unequal yoke of a very different sort. Does anybody remember, okay, C is the farmer carried an ox goad to prod his animals. Does anybody know? Well, it's right there, so I can't ask you. Judges 3:31. After him was Shamgar, the son of Anath, which slew of the Philistines 600 men with an ox goad. And he also delivered Israel. Wow. How did they plant their crops? Very much different than today. Seeds would be carried in a basket or a pouch. Imagine how long it took and how hard. And if even my ancestors that bought the farm, our family farm that we had to sell not too long ago, they had to clear everything by hand. And my great-great-grandpa had to plow with a horse. The yield was not anywhere near what it would be today. You go to a cornfield today and it's just packed with corn. And the bushels that they get per acre would just astonish my grandparents. Then it was even more difficult. Everything was done by hand. So you carry the seeds in a basket or a pouch, and then you go all the way back to the granary and you get more and you come back. B, he would plant the seeds by scattering them. And so Psalm 126, can anybody finish this? He that goeth forth and weepeth, bearing precious seed.
Doubtless come again, bringing his sheaves with him.
Yeah, and so that illustration is used there. The Lord used the parable of the sower and the seed. And because they're just scattering the seed, some fell on the ground that was hardened down and probably on a path. And birds of the air came and helped themselves because that's the way they did it. Otherwise, can you imagine how hard it would be just to plant one seed? They would scatter it. So the parable of sowing the seeds makes a whole lot more sense when you realize that that's the way they had to do it back then. It just, there's no way you could get your field planted any other way in time. So he would plant his seeds by scattering them, and then he would plow again to cover the seeds, or sometimes he would drag branches over the soil if it was, what would you call it, easily moved. Just drag branches over it and cover the seeds back up again. And then the harvest didn't get any easier. Grain was harvested with a sickle, and so Mark makes use of that practice. But when the fruit is brought forth, immediately he putteth in the sickle, because the harvest is come. And Jesus used this practice to illustrate witnessing in John chapter 4, verse 35. Say not ye, there are yet 4 months, and then cometh harvest? Behold, I say unto you, lift up your eyes, and look on the fields, for they are white already to harvest. I really appreciate the emphasis that our pastor and our church puts on witnessing, and especially relational evangelism, which I believe is, especially for today, absolutely the best means. Threshing, grain was taken to the threshing floor, and there were 3 methods of threshing, and one would be beating the stalks with a stick. Okay, let me stretch your memory. Does anybody remember a judge who was approached by an angel while he was threshing? Did you cheat? Okay, who?
Gideon?
Yes, Gideon. That's what he was doing. A second means was trampling the grain under an animal's feet. That's the winnowing. Is that the winnowing, or did you get a picture of the mill that the animals would?
I just got that one.
Okay,
That's not the same though.
okay.
Yeah.
Oftentimes they would yoke oxen together like that and have a heavy concrete disc that they would drag over the grain. And thresh it that way. Deuteronomy chapter 25:4, thou shalt not muzzle the ox when he treadeth out the corn. Does anybody remember how that's quoted in the New Testament, in what context? Okay.
On giving what's due to your pastors.
Yeah. I remember years ago, Mark Eddy, he and I were out calling, and we called on a couple of guys that were very disapproving of a church that would actually pay a pastor. They thought, like Paul, that they should, earn their own living. And I turned them to that passage, and they just laughed at me. But that's exactly what it's talking about. Then C, I guess I already talked about dragging a sledge over the grain.
I got a picture of that.
Excuse me?
There is a picture of that.
Okay. So very primitive, but very inventive. And, they're hard workers. Even 100 years ago, farmers still very, very hard workers, and even in many ways today as well. So I remember Psalm 1, the ungodly are not so, but they're like the chaff that the wind drives away. So that's winnowing. And they would throw the wheat or whatever it was up in the air, and the wind would drive the chaff away. And then they would gather the grain that was left behind. Then there were vineyards. When we were in Nazareth, one of the main attractions there was a vineyard. And You might recognize this old guy in that picture. Anybody want to take a stab at who that guy is? Moi. There was, the typical vineyard had a watchtower and a well. And I wish I would have looked up the reference in Mark that described it. So this vineyard they found in Nazareth. What do we know about Nazareth that's significant? That's where Jesus grew up. It's a small town, and so people look down on him as a result of that, just because he came from a small town, and it was in Galilee. Can any good thing come out of Galilee was a saying back then. I have to believe that the Lord, as a young child, was there at that vineyard. If you ever get a chance to go, do it. I hope our pastor gets to go. Okay, they often contained a watchtower. Drastic pruning was necessary for a maximum harvest. John 15:1-2, I am the true vine, my Father is the husbandman. Every branch in me that beareth not fruit he taketh away, and every branch that beareth fruit he purgeth it, that it may bring forth more fruit. Okay, livestock. First of all, most common livestock, other than work animals, was sheep. Their disposition is somewhat between meek and dull, and their lack of aggression makes them easy prey for the predators. So as a result, they were extremely, and still today are extremely, dependent upon shepherds. Matthew 9:36, but when he saw the multitudes, he was moved with compassion on them, because they fainted and were scattered abroad as sheep having no shepherd. And so he began to teach them many things. Can anybody remember a story in the Old Testament that would bear out D, sheep are affectionate animals? Normally you think about sheep, they're just, would you have a pet sheep? Would you have a pet chicken? But they, we don't really think of sheep as necessarily being affectionate animals. Maybe I'll give you a couple of hints. Nathan approaching David. Remember the story? Nope. Possibly. Was that a hand up? No.
Okay, after David committed murder on Uriah, that Nathan the prophet came and gave him a parable about a rich man that had company, and he took his poor neighbor that had one lamb, a pet lamb, and took it to offer for a meal for his friends instead of his own.
And that has always stood out in my mind because of the fact that you just don't normally think about being that affectionate toward a sheep. But they are affectionate animals. Also, what do we know about sheep? They're easily lost, and must be rescued. Now, this again is a wrong reference. It's not supposed to be Matthew 8. It's supposed to be Matthew 18, 12 and 13. How do you think? If a man has 100 sheep, and one of them be gone astray, doth he not leave the 99 and goeth into the mountains and seeketh that which is gone astray? And if it be so that he find it, verily I say unto you, he rejoiceth more of that sheep than of the 99 which went not astray. Even so it is not the will of your Father which is in heaven that one of these little ones should perish. So When we were there, we saw Bedouins. Bedouins are mostly sheep and goats. And they care for mostly sheep and goats. And they just go wherever there's vegetation. When they run out of vegetation, they're nomads. They just wander around. And so even today. And so remember what Joseph told the Pharaoh about his family that was not something that Egyptians really approved of?
Sheep herders,
Yeah,
the Egyptians didn't care for
yeah, yeah. So that was a very common, David was a shepherd, and it's very, very common between sheep and crops. That was basically the lifestyle of most Jewish people, especially in the Old Testament. Well, there's a lot of information about the sheepfold, especially in John chapter 10. The sheepfold was well built, consisting of high stone walls. And as you can see in the picture there, that's pretty typical of what a sheepfold would have looked like, even in New Testament times. Often the shepherds slept in what would that blank be? In the doorway. And so Jesus said unto them, Verily, verily, I say unto you, I am the door of the sheep. Isn't that a wonderful illustration? By me shall any man enter in. And sometimes several flocks stayed in the same fold. And you probably have all heard this story. Even in modern days, this takes place in the morning. Each flock would follow the voice of its shepherd. So Jesus said in John chapter 10, verse 27, My sheep hear my voice, I know them, they follow me. And if it's a voice of a stranger, they won't follow. Now, what is the voice of the stranger? They hear the shepherd's voice. They recognize it. And so even today, there would be places where they would go to water their sheep, several herds mixed up together. When it was time to go, the shepherd would call, and the sheep would recognize his voice and follow him. And so the Lord uses that illustration. And so what is the illustration of the voice that we do not recognize? That'd be a teacher of false doctrine, right? So it behooves us to really know our Bibles, because it is easy to be led astray by a false teacher that can be very convincing. Was it Mormons or Jehovah's Witnesses? I don't remember. Many of their convents were former Baptists or people like that. Now, they probably weren't saved yet, but they at least were going to that kind of a church. So we ought to know our Bible so well that when we start hearing something that it just doesn't sound right, and we're not going to follow that. We have some examples of people that have come to our church as a result. They went to their own church for a long time, and they started hearing things that just did not sound right. Evelyn is one example. All of you probably know that. And so that's what the Lord was talking about there. Okay, shepherds. The shepherd's life was harsh and dangerous. Predators and thieves posed a constant threat. 1 Samuel 17, 34, 35. David said unto Saul, Thy servant kept his father's sheep, and there came a lion and a bear, and took the lamb out of the flock, and I went out after him, and delivered it out of his mouth. And when he arose against me, I caught him by his beard, and smote him, and slew him. So the most common weapon was a what? Good guess. Yes, sling. And then B, so Dick, really your answer, I would have to give you credit for your answer too. B, he carried a staff for protection or to rescue a wayward sheep. And probably you've all seen that picture of Christ with a staff reaching down to a lamb and trying to pull that lamb up to safety. And I'm going to close with other livestock. Does this sound familiar? Goats, cattle, oxen, donkeys, horses, camels, chickens, ducks, geese. Does that all sound familiar? Even today, that's typically, in America, not camels, but over there, camels. Yeah, in fact, when we were in Israel, when we were in Petra, if you chose to, you could pay to have a camel ride you back to the entrance, which is about a 3.5-mile walk, and one lady did do that. We avoided the camels. Anybody know why? They're easy to get on. Smell is awful. I probably told you the story about the lady that she asked one of the owners what it would cost to ride a camel back to the entrance, and his price was too high. So another man came over to her and offered her a lower price, got her on the camel, and in the meantime, these two owners almost got in a fist fight. You stole my customer. No, I didn't. And so in the meantime, the camel took off. While they're fighting, yeah, she's scared, and you know it did go all the way back to the entrance. She had no idea how to get off of it. So a little boy came over and patted the camel on the head. It squatted down. She got off, and finally the owner caught up with her, and she apologized, and she said, "I'm so sorry. I didn't mean to cause a problem." And the man said, "Oh no, we're very good friends." So that was the story. Now I didn't mention the last one, pigs. Does that surprise you? Right. Unclean animals. But just because God forbade something did not mean that some people did not still do it. And so there were still some. Do you remember an example of that in the New Testament? Somebody that owned pigs.
Well, like, we cast out a demon that went into the herd of pigs and they ran off the hill and into the ocean.
Yeah. That was a huge herd of pigs, too. And so what were the response of the people when that happened? Yeah, ask him, please leave us. So what was more important to them? The man who was rescued from demon possession or the pigs? Obviously the pigs. So yes, they were forbidden, but people still did do it. Unfortunately, why do you suppose the Bible forbade people to eat pigs? Do you think we should not eat pork today? We're not under law. We do need to be careful about what we eat, and there are some things that really aren't good for a person. But there's some debate about that, but I don't see a problem. Okay, time's up. Any comments or questions or? Okay. Let's see, is next week the third week of the month? Yes, next week I believe would be the family service. Okay. Okay, you are dismissed. I'm in charge. I think what I'm going to do is show a video. I gave it to Pastor to review and get his approval, and he hasn't had time yet to